Hi and welcome to this sneak peek at the latest features coming up in Payara 4.1.151, which is due out in January next year. In this video we're going to basically look at the new Hazelcast capabilities built into Payara and how they can be used for web session persistence. So Hazelcast is a data grid and therefore allows you to store Java objects distributed across a number of JVMs in a highly available, resilient manner. So it's perfect for using for a session persistence store. So let's get started. Essentially, we've got a Payara installed already. We've got a current video on how to do that as well, but we'll start from there. So we can see we've got a standard Payara installation. We have just an administration server, no clusters, no standalone instances. So what we're going to do is create a new cluster. You do this in the same way as you would do this within GlassFish. So we're going to create a standard Payara cluster. So essentially we're going to create a new cluster called test cluster, create a couple of instances of Payara within that cluster. So that's test 1, test 2, and OK that. And then what we're going to do is we're going to deploy a web application to that cluster to show that the session state is shared between the two Payara instances. Pretty basic stuff. Before that, we'll just show a couple of new ASAdmin commands. So if I log into ASAdmin, so one command is get Hazelcast configuration. So that will show you the Hazelcast configuration by default on the DAS. We can see that on the DAS we have Hazelcast enabled. And let's just check it on our test cluster. And you can see by default that Hazelcast is disabled. This is essentially so that Payara is a drop-in replacement for GlassFish. So when it comes out the box, the Hazelcast integration is disabled so that it's the same as GlassFish. So what we need to do on our test cluster configuration is enable the Hazelcast on that. So that's set Hazelcast configuration, minus enabled equals true, minus target test cluster. So we'll just check that that is being done correctly. So we can see that it is true. So now we've got that enabled in our test cluster, so that target matches the name there. So you can see that the DAS configuration is going to use the same ports, multicast port and multicast group for Hazelcast as our cluster configuration. So that means within our domain we're going to have 3 JVMs, the DAS, the 2 cluster instances, all creating one big Hazelcast configuration cluster. And that means the session positions will be stored across all 3. We don't have to do that. It's with the set configuration we can change the multicast group so we can have multiple different Hazelcast clusters. But for this demonstration purposes, we're going to use the same group. So there's a couple of things we also need to do to the cluster config here. So we need to go into the availability service, make sure that's enabled, which it is, check web container availability, and there's a new persistence type with this version of Payara which is called Hazelcast, and we need to select that. And what that will do is make sure that HTTP sessions are stored within the Hazelcast store. So if we save that, and what I'm going to do is now we'll start the cluster. So if we start the cluster from the console, and while that's coming up, and that'll basically start both test 1 and test 2. I'll show you a new ASAdmin command as well, a new one called list Hazelcast members. By default this will run on the DAS, so if I run that, you can see that the DAS is running Hazelcast and it thinks there is 1 member in the Hazelcast cluster. Run it again, you can see now there are 3. It has itself called server, and it has test2, which is test2 Payara instance, and test1, which is the test1 Payara instance. So we have a Hazelcast cluster of 3, 1 being the DAS, and then 2 being our Payara cluster. So now we have that working. Let's deploy our application. So we go to applications, we'll deploy, and we have a very simple var file called cluster test, which is just a JSP, servlet. And when you're deploying, you must make sure that the availability is ticked, otherwise session replication will be disabled. And we choose our target as test cluster. Okay, so that will basically deploy our cluster test var onto test1 and test2 Payara instances. While that's deploying, you can also, when you're on list Hazelcast command, Hazelcast members, target it at the cluster itself, and it will basically get run on both cluster nodes, and that gives you an opportunity to make sure that they're all seeing the same thing. So you can see that test2 thinks there are 3 Hazelcast members in the cluster, and test1 also thinks there are 3, which is good. So they both see each other. So now our application has been deployed. So we have a simple application. So we're going to go to test1. That's its port. You can see that if we go into wrong place. If we go into the cluster instances test1, you can see it's listening on 280.81 and 280.81.82, and essentially instance 2 is on 280.80 to 8181. So if we go in here, this is 280.80, so this is actually instance 2. We can see that we have a session identifier. It's a very simple application, and we have a count. So if we run it multiple times, our count number goes up. So it's just storing an integer in the session. If we go on to the second one in the cluster, you can see that the number is 29. It was 28 before. We run it again, so it's 29. If we do that, it goes up. So there you have it. We have our session information stored in a Hazelcast cluster. Fairly simple stuff. So that's all there is actually to configure Hazelcast Session Persistence within the latest version of Payara. But I'm going to show you a new capability, which is a bit more powerful than that really, is to show that because our session state is actually in a Hazelcast cluster rather than in a standard GlassFish replicated Shoal store, we're going to fire up a few more Hazelcast nodes. So if we duplicate my putty session here, and what we're going to do is we're going to fire up a Hazelcast JVM on its own. So it's not a Payara JVM, it's a standard Hazelcast JVM. And so we go into a standard Hazelcast installation, go into the bin, and basically start the standard server. Because we're using the standard ports, this will join our Hazelcast cluster. And you can see as it boots up, it thinks there's 4 servers, which there are, 4 nodes. And these are these 3 here, plus itself. If we fire another couple of these up, and so you might be wondering why this is useful, because the reason this is useful is that your session state can then be spread across not just the Payara instances, but can also fire up additional JVMs. So that means either you can store a lot more state within the session and spread it across the resilient Hazelcast cluster, which can have garbage collection benefits in that your session state is taking up less heap space in your core application servers. It also has resilience capabilities, which we're just about to demonstrate. So So imagine that you want to restart your cluster and redeploy a new version of the application, but you don't want to lose your session state. So what we're doing here, you could do this. You could fire up 3 more Hazelcast nodes. They will elastically join together into a cluster, and the data, the session data, will be spread across all the nodes in that Hazelcast cluster. So if we go back in here just to check, and we can see that test 2 believes there's that many members now in its Hazelcast cluster, and test 1 believes there's that many. So that's fantastic. That's what we wanted. So let's just check our session is still available. There we go. So what we're going to do now then is we're going to basically take the whole cluster down. So if we go into, as in the whole Payara cluster, so we have our 2 nodes. We have our test cluster. The instances, both instances are running. So what we're going to do is we're going to just stop that whole cluster. So what we're going to do is to stop the whole cluster, but we won't lose the session data because it's within the various Hazelcast JVMs. As we can see here, they notice now that their member groups dropped to 4, basically because the 2 instances have come out of it. Before it was there were 6 members, and now there are 4, the DAS and the 3 others I started up. So if I now restart the Payara cluster, we will see that these little Hazelcast JVMs will print out that the Hazelcast cluster now has 6 members when these 2 guys are up. Here we go. So now we have 6 members in the cluster. If we go back to our session, bit too quick there. And we go back to this one. We can see that we haven't lost our persistent data, that the count hasn't gone dropped back to 0. It's still going up from where it was before. So that shows you that the new Hazelcast capabilities within Payara allow you to create powerful data grid topologies for storing your session persistence. Later videos will show how we've also integrated Hazelcast for JSR107 JCache capabilities, so that's in there now as well. If you look at the Hazelcast configuration, you can see that there's a Hazelcast instance actually stored at the JNDI name Payara/Hazelcast, and you can use that for JSR107 JCache manipulations, and we'll show that in a later video. So I hope you enjoy this Payara sneak peek video, and if you want to get the latest Payara, you can download it from our website here for the releases, and pre-release builds are basically on this page and they can get down from Jenkins. Thanks for watching.